You feel fine around people.
Nothing shifting.
You can spend time with them, have conversations, stay connected in a way that feels natural. Nothing feels off in the moment. You show up, you engage, you respond in ways that seem normal. And from the outside, there is no clear issue. Everything appears to be working. But there is a shift that happens. Not all the time, not in every interaction, but in specific moments that tend to stand out. The moment you actually need something. Support, help, follow through from someone else. That is usually when something changes. Not necessarily around you, but within you. And that shift often reveals a pattern that has been there all along. For many people, functioning independently creates stability. Not just in a practical sense, but in a way that shapes how your day moves. You take care of what needs to be handled. You organize your responsibilities. You keep things moving without waiting on others. And that creates a certain rhythm. Things get done on time, decisions happen quickly, there is no need to pause and check if something will follow through. And because of that, things tend to stay in place. There is less uncertainty, less delay, less reliance on variables you cannot control. You are not waiting for responses. You are not adjusting to someone else's timing. Everything moves based on your pace. That creates a sense of consistency. You know what to expect because you are the one managing it. You can anticipate outcomes. You can adjust before something becomes an issue. And that predictability starts to feel normal. Over time, that becomes your standard way of operating. Not something you think about directly, just the way things are done. You do not need to coordinate as much. You do not need to depend on timing outside of your control. Everything stays within your reach, within your awareness, within your ability to adjust. And because that works, it becomes your baseline, the default setting for how things are handled when everything is functioning normally. It feels efficient, it feels reliable, and most importantly, it feels certain. When a pattern works consistently, it tends to repeat. Not because you are deciding to repeat it, but because it keeps producing the same result. Each time you handle something on your own, you confirm that it is effective. You solve the issue, you move forward. There are no complications, there is no delay, no need to follow up, no need to adjust around someone else's timing. Everything resolves cleanly. And that clarity matters because it removes friction. It allows things to move from problem to resolution without interruption. And over time, that begins to register, not in a conscious way, but as a pattern you come to rely on. Handling things yourself leads to smoother outcomes, fewer delays, fewer misunderstandings, fewer variables that need to be managed. And because of that, it starts to feel like the more efficient option, even when other options exist, even when involving someone else might be possible. You begin to default to what has already worked, not because it is the only way, but because it is the most familiar way to reach a clear outcome. And the more this happens, the more the pattern strengthens. Each repetition makes it easier to choose the same response again. Each successful outcome confirms that it is reliable. So the pattern continues because it keeps proving itself. And the more it proves itself, the less reason there is to interrupt it. It becomes the path of least resistance, the way things are handled without needing to reconsider it each time. The shift does not happen in everyday moments. It does not show up when things are manageable. It does not appear when you are operating within your usual range. Most of the time, everything stays within what you can handle. And in those moments, nothing feels different. The pattern continues without interruption. But the shift happens when something moves outside of that range, when the situation requires more than what you can manage on your own. Something requires input, support, participation from someone else. And that is where the pattern meets a limit. There is a pause, not always visible, but something you register internally. A moment where you recognize that this is not something you can fully manage on your own. And that recognition feels different. It slows things down slightly. It introduces a level of uncertainty that is not usually there. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but noticeable, because it interrupts how things usually work. It breaks the rhythm you are used to relying on, the rhythm where you move directly from problem to solution without needing anything external. And now that path is not fully available, which makes the moment stand out. Not because of intensity, but because it does not fit the pattern you are used to following. When that moment appears, your response tends to shift inward. It happens quickly, almost at the same time you recognize that something is needed. Before anything is expressed outwardly, your attention moves inward. You begin to think through alternatives. What can be adjusted? What can be simplified? What can be handled differently so that it stays within your control? You start reorganizing the situation, not in a visible way, but internally. You look for ways to reduce what is needed from others. You narrow it down, you make it smaller, more manageable. You adjust the situation so it fits back into what you can manage yourself. Not because support is unavailable, not because no one could help, but because adjusting feels more immediate, more within your control. There is no waiting, no uncertainty about how it will be handled. You can move on it right away. So instead of moving outward toward someone else, you move inward toward problem solving. You focus on what can be done now, what can be resolved quickly. And that shift feels natural, familiar, like a continuation of how you usually operate. And often that leads you back to handling it on your own, not as a deliberate choice, but as the path that feels the most direct in the moment. Over time, something else develops. It is not always obvious at first. It does not show up as a clear change, but it builds gradually through repetition. The act of needing support becomes less familiar, not because the need disappears, not because you stop experiencing moments where support would be helpful, but because those moments are handled differently. They are redirected, adjusted, managed internally. So the experience of involving someone else does not happen as often. And when something is not used regularly, it starts to feel less natural over time. You become more practiced at handling things independently. You get faster at it, more efficient, more certain in how you respond. You know how to move through situations without needing to pause or involve anyone else. And at the same time, you become less practiced at involving others. Not in a conscious way, but in a way that affects how automatic it feels. So when those moments do come up, they feel different, less familiar, less built into your normal response. There is more hesitation, more consideration, not because it is difficult, but because it is not your default. It does not feel as immediate as handling it yourself, so it feels less natural, less automatic, and more uncertain than simply returning to what you already know how to do. You feel fine with people because the version of you that shows up most often does not require much. And that works. It keeps things smooth, predictable, easy to maintain, until something falls outside of what you can handle alone. That is when the pattern becomes visible. Not as a problem, but as a structure that developed over time. One that made things easier in some ways and more limited in others. And most people do not notice it until they find themselves needing something they are not used to asking for. Not because it is unavailable, but because it does not feel like the way they usually function. And that is usually the moment where the pattern becomes clear, not in what you do, but in what feels natural to you.